Mohammed, he, him pronouns, community organizer and civic engagement lead at the New Pride Agenda. Today, we have a phenomenal guest with us, Congressman Ritchie Torres. Before I hand it off to our own Dan Tietz to moderate a discussion, I want to go over some quick logistics. We encourage you to put the screen in gallery view so you can see all of our faces at once. If you run into any tech problems, I'll shoot my number in the chat box. Encourage you to reach out and I'll try to help troubleshoot. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dan. I will say in the first 2 weeks of March, please keep an eye out for an upcoming virtual town hall on the state budget. We're going to be having newly elected State Senator Jabari Brisport on, along with Brad Hoylman and a few other elected officials talking about queer priorities on a state level that should be incorporated into the April 1st budget. So keep an eye out for that. And Dan, it's all yours.
Oh, Dan, you're on mute.
Unmute. Can you hear me now?
You're being silenced. Now I can hear you.
Can you hear me now? We're good? I'm Dan Tietz. I'm a board member for New Pride Agenda, and I'm really happy to be here today with our very special guest for a one-on-one conversation, Congressman Ritchie Torres. Before we start, let me just say a word or two about New Pride Agenda. The New Pride Agenda is a statewide LGBTQ nonprofit focused on education and advocacy for New York State's LGBTQ community. And I think that's particularly as it relates to transgender, gender nonconforming, non-binary members of our community, folks who are really most vulnerable and need help across New York State. Over the past year, we've hosted some 20 virtual town halls, a couple each month on a wide range of topics, COVID-19 to police accountability, to elections reforms. Over the next few months, we're hoping to expand our presence across the state through a Western New York upstate organizer, as well as a new executive director, leading to yet more exciting and necessary work on behalf of all LGBTQ New Yorkers. Now I'd like to introduce Congressman Ritchie Torres. Representative Torres is a fighter from the Bronx who has spent his entire life working for the community he calls home. Like many in the South Bronx, poverty and struggle have never been abstractions to him, and he governs from a place of lived experience. Raised by a single mother, together with his twin brother and his sister in public housing, he knows what it means to live in a minimum wage home, working hard for short money with lots of challenges. In 2013, at the age of 25, Richie became New York City's youngest elected official and the first openly LGBTQ person elected to office from the Bronx. At the city council, Richie stood out, and during his 7-year tenure, he tenaciously tackled problems big and small for the Bronx and New York City. He passed over 40 pieces of legislation, including legislation protecting the city's affordable housing stock and tackling the city's opioid epidemic. As chairman overseeing NYCHA, he held the first committee hearing ever in public housing, which led to a $3 billion FEMA investment, the largest in New York City's history. As chair of the Oversight and Investigations Committee, Richie has led investigations into the heating outages and lead poisoning at NYCHA, the taxi medallion scandal, the city's controversial third-party transfer program, and the Kushner companies. Richie lives in the South Bronx and represents New York's 15th district in the South Bronx, and is now is a member of the Committee on Financial Services in the House and serves as vice chair of the Committee on Homeland Security. So please, everyone, meet Congressman Ritchie Torres.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Dan, as always.
Thanks. So let's get right to it. I think there's probably no more important place to start today than the horror and tragedy of the insurrection and assault on the Capitol on January 6th, which was then, of course, as you know, promptly followed by the former president's second impeachment. Together, these events undoubtedly made your first days in office as a member of the House unlike that experience really by any in history, aside from your fellow new members. Tell us about your experience that day and your thoughts on what happened and where you suggest we go from here.
Well, it's good to be with you, Dan. And the last time I saw you in person was about 1.5 years ago. And if you had said to me then that I would become a member of Congress during an infectious disease outbreak, to witness an insurrection against the US Capitol during the Electoral College vote count, and that I would then vote to impeach an outgoing president who had been impeached once before, and all of that would happen within the span of 2 weeks. I would have said that sounds dramatic enough to be a movie. It's been an emotional roller coaster. This has been the most draining and disorienting introduction for any freshman class in the modern history of the United States Congress. You know, on January 6th, I was in the Cannon building when all of a sudden the Capitol Police stormed into my office, directing my staff and me to immediately evacuate. And so I was left wandering through the labyrinth of office buildings connected to the Capitol. And in the meantime, these rioters had breached the US Capitol, had invaded the Senate chamber, had invaded the office of Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and even terrorized members of Congress and their staff. Eventually, I was brought to a secure location, which itself became a super spreading event. And my experience of January 6th was reminiscent of 9/11. You know, I never thought that there could ever be an attack on the Twin Towers, and then it happened. I never thought that there could be an attack on the US Capitol, and then it happened. So I was in a state of shock, and the Capitol was a scene of panic and pandemonium. And for me, it tells a deeper story. There are two conflicting realities shaping American politics. There's the reality of America as a multiracial democracy. Right? 70% of the House Democratic Caucus consists of members of the LGBTQ community, people of color, and women. Right? So America is gradually becoming a multiracial, multi-ethnic, LGBTQ inclusive democracy. But then, as demonstrated on January 6th, there's the reality of white supremacy. And the siege on the US Capitol was not simply an attack on a physical structure, it was an attack on the very idea of America as a multiracial democracy.
Yes.
And so that's the central tension of American politics. But what gave me hope was I went from witnessing the insurrection at the hands of white supremacists to witnessing the inauguration.
Yes.
And for me, the image of Kamala Harris, a woman, a Black person, an Asian American in the vice presidency, being sworn in by Sonia Sotomayor, the first Latina on the United States Supreme Court, that moment to me is a distillation of how far we've come as a country. And it serves as a reminder that the future of our country does not belong to white supremacy. The future of our country belongs to multiracial democracy.
Yeah, and sworn in by, of course, your fellow Bronxite, Justice Sotomayor.
Bronx was well represented. J-Lo, Sonia Sotomayor.
Right, that's true, exactly. That's true. The Bronx was very present at the inauguration. I want to turn now to, I'm sorry about that, by the way. I think, I don't want to skip right by this, but I think for all of us, it was horrifying to watch. I mean, I'm not unlike probably many others who had the TV on. You're like watching it as it happens, which of course was the focus of the impeachment, right? Which is, we're all witnesses who didn't see it. So I do think that we are in a tenuous place at this moment. I think that I'm very pleased that the speaker has brought in someone capable of doing an investigation akin to a post 9/11 commission. I think that's terribly important here. We shouldn't let this pass by.
Look, January 6th was a wake-up call, right? There are white supremacists who are intent on doing harm to minorities in every form: racial minorities, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, sexual minorities. There are people who cannot come to grips with the defeat of Donald Trump, who cannot come to grip with the changing complexion of the country. And, for me, politics is an alternative to violence. And when you cause your followers to lose trust in politics, as Donald Trump has done, then you're inviting those supporters to resort to violence. And so January 6th was not an event that should be viewed in isolation. It was the culmination of a months-long delegitimation campaign against American democracy itself.
Absolutely. I want to turn a little bit to the business now, though. So we're to going forward. You know, you mentioned quite rightly the COVID-19 pandemic and how well the U.S. has or hasn't done with in addressing that. But also, as we know, just the other day, just the end of last week, the Equality Act was reintroduced in the House. And so I want to talk a little bit about, for sure, the Equality Act, but also what you see are as must-pass bills in 2021 and how we might get them done, including through a very narrowly divided Senate and onto the president's desk. You know, I think that the Equality Act for sure is particularly important to the LGBTQ community, but I think we all fear some watering down by some to try and get it done. So if you could talk about what you see as must-pass bills and maybe touch upon the Equality Act.
Look, the highest legislative priority for the Equality Caucus is the Equality Act, which would amend civil rights law to protect the LGBTQ community from discrimination in matters of employment, housing, public accommodation, in nearly every arena of life. You know, we as LGBTQ people, we know we're equal by nature and we should be equal in the eyes of the law. And the Equality Act would represent the greatest codification of LGBTQ equality that we've seen in the history of the United States. And I'm proud to report that every Democrat in the House Democratic Caucus is a supporter of the Equality Act. It's a historic breakthrough for our community to have unanimous support within the federal Democratic Party. You know, the greatest obstruction to the path to progress is the filibuster. You know, as long as the filibuster remains in place, Republicans are going to have the ability to obstruct the Equality Act. And it's not clear to me that we can secure enough votes from Republicans to reach the 60 vote threshold. So I
Let me
continue.
just ask you about the filibuster. So I appreciate that you're not in the Senate. Yeah, there's still time. There's still time. You might get there. But thoughts on what should happen with the filibuster? Ought it even exist?
We should abolish the filibuster. The filibuster magnifies the anti-democratic bias of the U.S. Senate. Right? The U.S. Senate on its own is deeply undemocratic.
Yes.
Right? There are states that are the size of my congressional district that receive 2 U.S. senators, the same number as California and New York. And the Senate has a role in nominating, confirming Supreme Court justices. It's deeply undemocratic, and the filibuster allows a U.S. senator who represents just as many people as I do to unilaterally, to single-handedly obstruct the priorities of a Democratic president and a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate. And that to me is profoundly undemocratic. And you know, we in the Democratic Party have to be every bit as ruthless and relentless in building Democratic power as Mitch McConnell has been in building Republican power. And part of building Democratic power is abolishing the filibuster, which is the single greatest obstacle to progressive policymaking in America.
Now, because you made that statement, I'm going to make just a brief note about NPA being a nonpartisan 501c3, and the view just expressed was the congressman's, not necessarily that of NPA. But I do think, I mean, I think even if we do lowercase democratic power, I think your earlier point was the right one, which is that a supermajority, which is really what the filibuster calls for, is on its face undemocratic, lowercase d, undemocratic. So even setting aside the problem of having 2 senators in a state like Wyoming, as well as 2 senators in a state like California, with many, many times the population, it is, you know, of course, just feeds that sort of undemocratic nature.
Which is precisely what I meant. When I meant anti-democratic bias, I meant small d dem.
Yeah, yes.
Is that there's a counter-majoritarian structure to the U.S. Senate that creates a problem, and that leads to that really overwhelmingly concentrates political power in a small set of states that are much more rural and much whiter and much more conservative than the rest of the country.
Right. No, I think that's exactly right. I think our challenge across the country is where, I mean, even if you look at, for example, just the recent impeachment, the votes for that impeachment by far represent a significant majority of Americans, by far, not even a close call, 2/3 almost in that vote in the Senate. So even though, you know, again, 57 senators is a clear majority, no president's ever been impeached by that number, but for sure, a distinct majority of senators from states with significant populations. So do you think we've got Republican votes for an Equality Act that's been more or less as introduced in the House? Do you think that there are Republican votes for that? And do you see that there are some weak links among Democrats in the Senate?
I'm confident that we're going to have a unified Democratic Party behind the Equality Act. And I'm confident that we're going to have some measure of bipartisan, bicameral support. The question is, are we going to have enough bipartisan support to overcome the filibuster? And that remains to be seen.
Yeah. Do you worry at all about amendments, particularly from the Senate? I don't see this as much of an issue potentially in the House, that, you know, get fairly expansive with regards to religious exemptions. So I do worry that we've seen that in other legislation. So the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, for example, and its several iterations have carved out exceptions to anti-discrimination law in some way, shape, or form. And do you worry about that?
Look, I worry about a religious exception that swallows the rule.
Yeah.
And I worry about the targeting of the trans community in particular.
Yes.
And you hear all this nonsense about sports and so those are the two concerns I have, but I'm confident that the Democratic Party is going to remain firm in preserving the bedrock of the Equality Act.
Good. With regard to other priorities, what do you see as other must-pass bills? We talked a little bit about, of course, COVID, and you know, the president has proposed a nearly $2 billion bill there, and I know that there's been lots of talk about using reconciliation to get that done. Any thoughts on the sort of other must-pass bills? I mean, we've, you know, I think we've got lots of push, quite rightly, with regard to HR 1 for the People Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, the Green New Deal, student loan relief. But there's a bunch of bills. But what would, you know, immigration reform? What would you see as the must-pass bills?
You know, everything that you brought up, but you know, on the LGBTQ front, you know, we have to recognize that the Equality Act is the floor, not the ceiling. And we have to be mindful of the social service needs of the LGBTQ community. I worry about the crisis of housing insecurity and homelessness among LGBTQ youth. I worry about the high rates of anxiety and depression and suicidal ideation among LGBT elders. I worry about the epidemic of violence against the Black trans community in particular. So those are issues that we have to address in Congress, and we have the largest and most diverse LGBTQ caucus in the history of the United States Congress, and I feel like we're well positioned to address issues that focus on the full range of the LGBTQ community.
With regard to health in particular, you just mentioned a couple of things there, and I think they're sort of interrelated. So sort of housing security, of course, is health, right? And that's maybe particularly true for people with an at-risk for HIV in your district. Of course, HIV is by no means solved. We've got great efforts, state and city, with regard to ending the HIV epidemic, but not, I think that we've had a little less coherence, I'm going to use that word, with regards to federal efforts, and particularly, you know, following the Trump administration. So any thoughts on kind of the health needs for your district and going forward, maybe with a particular focus on transgender health and in particular HIV?
Look, communities of color like mine have much higher rates of HIV and AIDS mortality because of inequality. And I think for me, the greatest lesson learned from COVID-19 is it tells a deeper story about social determinants of health. Is, we have to take a holistic approach. Truvada alone is not going to end the epidemic. We have to ensure that those with HIV or those at risk of, of, of getting HIV have access to employment and housing and healthcare. We have to take a comprehensive approach to improving the social determinants of health and protecting those who might be at risk of acquiring an infectious disease.
With regard to maybe opportunities for funding, I mean, obviously, we've got lots of budget challenges, I think is fair to say, although I'd love to hear your thoughts on there's a $1.9 trillion COVID bill, which is going to fund a bunch of things, not least the president has proposed money for cities and states, which have been hard hit, tax losses and so forth, and then just the additional cost of addressing the COVID pandemic. But do you see opportunities to fit into some of this legislation, whether it's the COVID bill or elsewhere, or just the coming budget year, targeted resources, more targeted resources for the LGBTQ community to address some of those needs you just pointed out?
Look, I'm hopeful that the American Rescue Plan will disproportionately benefit communities of color and the LGBTQ community. As you know, there's a whole ecosystem of community-based organizations that serve our community that depend on the stability of local and state government. And local and state government have gone nearly a year without an emergency infusion of funding from the federal government.
Right. In fact, many of those organizations are very much at risk without those public funds.
The ecosystem is in danger of collapsing, and we are about to allocate well over $300 billion to state and local governments. And New York State in particular will receive over $70 billion in aid, which will stabilize not only city and state government, but the whole ecosystem of LGBTQ service providers that depend on the stability of local and state government.
I think here too, do you expect that gets done, that those changes get done via reconciliation?
Yes, we're going to get it done by reconciliation, and I'm optimistic that we'll get it done by mid-March.
Oh, you think that we'll have it that soon? You think that the COVID bill will be done by mid-March?
That's my hope. I'm confident we'll get it done in March.
And do you believe that it'll largely look as the president has proposed, or do you expect that there are some areas that are going to be really hard to get done, even via reconciliation?
There are some pieces that are more contested than others. There is agreement on the need for local and state aid. What is controversial is the minimum wage. I'm strongly in favor of including a $15 minimum wage in the reconciliation package, which according to the CBO would raise incomes for 17 million Americans and lift 900,000 Americans out of poverty. But it remains a question as to whether the minimum wage is ultimately going to survive the reconciliation package. But I am supremely confident that the $1.9 trillion package will include robust local and state aid that will stabilize our LGBTQ service providers.
Do you think that the $1,400 that's been proposed, so essentially the $600 that was provided late last year, plus the 14 is the $2,000 that folks have talked about for households earning below a certain sum? I know that Senator Joe Manchin, among others, Kirsten Sinema from Arizona, have talked about bringing that number down. Any thoughts on that?
I think we in the House Democratic Caucus are firm on maintaining, we promised the American people up to $2,000, and we ought to keep our promise. But, the package is likely to include historic direct payments to families in need. Not only are families in need going to receive a one-time $1,400 check, but families will receive an enhanced child tax credit which will increase from $2,000 to $3,000, or in some cases as high as $3,600. And families will receive an enhanced unemployment check from $300 to $400 every week. In addition to those direct economic payments, families in need will receive greater nutritional assistance, and homeowners and renters are going to receive greater housing assistance. So the support that we're bringing to struggling families is overwhelming.
Just in terms of other legislative priorities, of course, certainly in the, again, note that NPA is a nonpartisan, right? I'm asking this question in the context of that you're a Democratic member of the House right now. In the majority, it's a narrow majority. What do you think needs to get done in this session before the next election in 22 that would ensure that you remain in the majority? Because as you know, unless you're in the majority in the House, you are largely powerless to get anything done. So most of, any bill that you would submit if you were in the minority isn't going to probably go anywhere. But so any thoughts on what you think has to get done in order for the voters at the midterms and which seems like a bizarre thing to ask just a few months after election, but you know how it works. So any sense on what must get done?
Look, for me, the highest priority should be to put Americans back to work and to put money in the pockets of families struggling during COVID-19. So once we pass the American Rescue Plan, the focus should shift toward a massive infrastructure package. And infrastructure is not simply about roads and bridges. It should be about parks and libraries, public hospitals, and public transit, and public schools, and public housing. We need to make long overdue investments in the infrastructure and future of our country. And frankly, if we can squander trillions of dollars on wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, then we should be able to invest trillions of dollars in the infrastructure of America. So that should be our next priority. Second, I would advocate for a permanent expansion of the child tax credit. Child poverty cost our country $1 trillion every year. And for me, a permanent child tax credit would complete what Medicare and Social Security began. It would eradicate poverty among the most vulnerable members of our society. A decent society should be dedicated to eradicating poverty among senior citizens and children especially. And if we were to permanently expand the child tax credit, we would cut child poverty by 45% in the span of a single year. So I would argue infrastructure and a permanent expansion of the child tax credit would be my two highest priorities. And by infrastructure, at the core of that is more affordable housing.
Yeah, for sure. Particularly given your district, you think about the needs, the housing needs in your district. As we both know, homelessness is a big issue here. Thankfully, New York has a right to shelter, but really what we want is for folks to have the opportunity to live in good, affordable, permanent housing. And maybe talk a little bit about that. You've seen the nominee for HUD, and I think we need lots more federal support. So, for example, your previous role with NYCHA and oversight of NYCHA, I mean, a big issue here is the absence of federal dollars on capital. I mean, just capital expenditures, making improvements, not just to New York's public housing, certainly New York's public housing, by far the largest public housing authority in the country, but broadly. Any thoughts on that?
Look, public housing has been so systematically defunded at the hands of the federal government that it has $40 billion worth of unmet capital needs. So there are senior citizens who are freezing in their homes with the boilers breaking down because of the federal government. There are children who have been poisoned by lead in their own homes because of the federal government. The federal government has shown itself to be the worst slumlord in the United States. And in addition to housing quality, there's a lack of affordable housing. The gap between the supply of affordable housing and the demand is shocking. In the mayor's housing plan, there was a revealing statistic. There are about 1 million households that earn at or below 50% of AMI. But there's only 420,000 units available to those households. So that's a gap of 520,000 units. Like, we have to commit ourselves to creating affordable housing on a scale and to an extent that we've never seen before. It has to be a massive infrastructure investment on the part of our country, because for me, housing is a human right. Housing is not simply brick and mortar. It's the foundation on which you build a better life for yourself and your family. If you're an LGBTQ youth and you're evicted from your home at the hands of your own parents, right?
Yeah.
The loss of housing stability destabilizes every aspect of your life. You're more vulnerable to mental illness and substance abuse and sex trafficking. And it's hardly an accident that LGBTQ youth would have the highest rates of housing insecurity and homelessness, also have the highest rates of suicide. There's an intimate connection between health and housing.
Absolutely. I want to turn maybe again to Senator Schumer. He and Senator Elizabeth Warren have focused on canceling $1,000 in student debt. I see you smile. I'm beginning to think you might have some. I think it's a winning issue. If you just look at polling, it's a winning issue. The president has been more reluctant on this subject. To tell us what you think about what it would mean if, in fact, we could get through the House and Senate. Maybe give us your opinion on getting something like that through the House and Senate, canceling $50,000 of student debt, and then onto the president's desk and getting his signature. What do you think the odds are?
There's no need to go to the House and Senate. The president has the
that's correct. Yeah, right.
The president has the legal authority to cancel up to $50,000 in student debt. What's lacking is the political will. The system of higher education in America is fundamentally broken. We produce far more debt than we do degrees. There are too many students who leave college not with degrees that lift them up, but with debt that weighs them down. And people should think deeply about the profound impact of student debt, right? When most millennials, most members of Generation Z cite student debt as the main reason for not buying a home. And without a home, you have no means of creating and passing down intergenerational wealth, right? And which will drive the persistence of the racial wealth gap in America. The most important life choices that we make as individuals, the decision to buy a home, the decision to open a business, the decision to have a family and have children and get married, all of those decisions are delayed and distorted by the overhang of student debt. So the consequences of student debt, of a $1.7 trillion student debt burden, is far more broadly and deeply destructive than most people, including the president, fully appreciate. Second, according to the Federal Reserve, students on average pay somewhere between $200 and $300 every month toward their student debt. If the president were to cancel student debt up to $50,000, it would be the equivalent of sending those students, many of whom are single mothers in the Bronx, the equivalent, a monthly check of $300 every month. Right? I could make a powerful case that student debt cancellation is the only form of economic stimulus that can be enacted by executive order.
Yeah.
So for me, it's a no-brainer, and I'm baffled by the president's opposition.
Yeah, there's plenty of evidence. As you know, Elizabeth Warren's been focused on this for a good long while, and in large part because she believes, and I think there's good evidence for it, that the economic impact of canceling that is enormous, but far more than its cost to the Treasury. How do you think we get
and almost all student debt is held by the federal government.
That's right. That's right.
And our students are victims of predatory practices by loan servicers, by colleges, both for-profits and the non-for-profits have been predatory in their pricing. And there's been disinvestment from higher education at every level of government, which has led students to take out ever greater levels of debt.
Right.
We're condemning a whole generation of Americans to indentured servitude.
Yeah, and that's just even setting aside the quality of the education in some instances, particularly with the for-profit colleges, which have been raised as well. So even the cost that the burden that they're bearing for an education that wasn't even arguably a quality education. So how do you think we persuade the president?
Good trouble. We have to create pressure. Have to keep agitating.
I think that's probably
Keep
right.
causing the trouble. The president is responsive to the ideological currents of our times.
I want to ask you just a little bit around earmarks generally. So you've probably heard that there's some conversation about bringing those back. Just I think for the audience's purpose, earmarks went away, I guess, what now, 15 years ago? It's been a while, 20 years, maybe even that much, where, members of Congress and senators had essentially pots of money that they could target to projects and initiatives in their districts. Thoughts on whether we should want earmarks, and if we do, how best to do that?
Well, there's certainly a place for earmarks, and I would support community-based projects, as we might call it. But we have to ensure that it's transparent, it's accountable, and equitable. I want to see to it that communities with the greatest need, like the South Bronx, get their fair share of federal funding. And there needs to be an equity lens. We have to see to it that we're serving the needs of racial and ethnic and sexual minorities that historically have been left behind by the federal budgeting process.
Right. I mean, the old jokes about, the bridges to nowhere with some senator's name on it. And I presume you're saying we should make sure we don't have that as part of this process.
But go beyond that. I think what I want is not only a process free of corruption,
yeah,
but also a process that prioritizes equity.
Yes, absolutely. Thoughts on just aside from maybe the more serious content here, how's your transition to DC been in this moment? Any personal ups and downs about that or things you weren't expecting and
my dating life has taken a toll. I'm kidding. It's been, it's awkward to be in Congress during COVID-19 because Congress is a collegial institution, right? It's all about relationships. You're only as strong as the relationships you build. And, without the ability to break bread over dinner, without the ability to schmooze freely on the House floor, the ability to build relationships has been hamstrung by COVID-19. And so that has been a real price that the freshman class is paying. But I'm making the most of it. I'm fully staffed up. We've hit the ground running. We're active in hearings. And I feel like I belong here. I feel like I was tailor-made for the United States Congress, and I was prepared well by the City Council. I feel like Congress is a natural progression from the New York City Council because as a council member, I have an on-the-ground knowledge of how federal policies operate at the local level. And I'm bringing that on-the-ground knowledge to inform my policymaking in Washington, D.C.
As an LGBT man of color, and from New York, so you're kind of a part of several natural sort of caucuses or delegations. You're part of the New York delegation, broadly speaking. You're part of the New York City, just to even get that narrower. But also, the LGBT caucus in the House, among others. Talk a little bit about what, to your point about the collegiality and the way in which you work across those caucuses to get your agenda done.
Well, I'm one of the first members of Congress to break the barrier and join both the Congressional Hispanic Caucus and the Congressional Black Caucus. And, it's worth noting that in the history of the United States Congress, there have been little more than 130 Latinx members of Congress, and none of them were LGBTQ until my election.
Yeah.
in the history of the United States Congress, there have been a little more than 160 Black members, and none of them were LGBTQ into the election of Mondaire Jones and myself. So I feel like, I feel deeply the weight of history on my shoulders, and I feel a deep sense of obligation to represent the LGBTQ community, particularly LGBTQ communities of color, as effectively as I can, because I'm a first, and so is Mondaire. And with trailblazing comes a special responsibility. Representation is both a blessing and a burden.
Sure. That's probably a good place to wrap up this conversation. I know that we don't want to keep you too long, and we agreed to 45 minutes, and we're about there. Any final thoughts?
I'm optimistic about the future. A Democratic president, a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate presents us with an FDR moment. I feel like we have a historic opportunity to govern as boldly in the 21st century as FDR did in the 20th century, and to serve the LGBTQ community to an extent we have not seen before. So I'm hopeful. The challenges that lie ahead are profound, but I feel as confident as I've ever been.
Great. Thank you so much, Congressman. Again, Congressman Ritchie Torres, thank you for your time today and sharing some of your thoughts on where to from here.
Of course, always a pleasure. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I just want to let folks in the audience know that this conversation has been recorded and we'll be re-airing it this Thursday evening. I would also like to thank Dan again for a great informative discussion, leaving me a little bit more optimistic on this snowy Monday. And so I appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us, and stay tuned for more virtual town halls. We'll be back in the first 2 weeks of March talking state budget. You'll hear more from me. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.